Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Psychology of Business podcast. My name is Dr. Brandon Griffin, and joining me in my virtual studio is Dr. Julie Exline. How's it going today, Julie?
It's going great. Thank you, Brandon, for having me on the podcast.
Thank you. So, Julie has a really interesting background. She is currently at the University of Virginia, but she has spent her career working on a wide variety of topics related to psychology. But what I'm interested in talking with her about today is the work that she's doing in the Division of Perceptual Studies, but also her work on religious and spiritual studies in general, but also in the workplace. So, Julie, before we dive into that and I ask you some more specific questions, could you give a general background on who you are, what you've been doing, what you're excited about, and just general background on you?
Sure. So I have just come to the University of Virginia after being at Case Western Reserve University, which is in Cleveland, Ohio, for 28 years. So three of those were a postdoc, and then 25 years on the faculty. So I came out of an environment that I would describe as just a very traditional psychology department at a research university. And I was always interested in studying topics related to spirituality and religion and existential issues. And that always made me kind of an outlier because in traditional psychology departments, and I was in clinical psychology, clinical and social, but I was officially clinical. Most people were studying specific disorders, like depression or PTSD. So I was always kind of an outlier studying these spiritual types of topics. And I think in that type of environment, you're often viewed with a certain amount of suspicion because people are afraid that you're trying to convert them to a certain religion or convert them away from religion or things like that. So that was that's been kind of a lifelong career challenge for me. And then I ended up receiving a really unusual opportunity, pretty late in my career to start this new chapter here at the Division of Perceptual Studies. This group was founded back in 1967 by Dr. Ian Stevenson, and he had been the chair of psychiatry here at UVA, and he branched off to create this special division, which he protected and guarded very carefully, focusing on extraordinary human experiences. So these are things around the boundary of life and death. He was interested in young children who seemed to have these memories suggesting past lives, and there were often these details that could be verified. So that was a lot of the work that he started with. And in my workplace now, the types of things we've been studying have included those topics around these possible memories suggesting reincarnation with kids and near-death experiences, uh, and related phenomena having to do with kind of this life-death boundary or the possibility of a broader consciousness. So I know we'll get back to all that, but I went from studying psychological things to studying spiritual things through a psychological lens to now we're going to be studying these kind of extraordinary experiences through a lens that's sometimes psychological, but sometimes also looks to see whether these types of claims of these experiences can actually be verified. Is so looking a little bit more at the question of evidence for whether something like, life after death is a real thing or not.
Well, thank you. And that's very interesting to me from a personal level, but also from a academic level. I've been interested in spirituality and religion just based on my background, and I'm trying to figure out how to work that into my research portfolio because I'm an organizational behavior. So I've been interested in that. But I would love to ask you some questions about your current position and your work. But first off, can you share how you became interested in studying spiritual and religious struggles? And it's interesting from your psychological view because you may think of religious and spiritual struggles as from a more theological lens. But can you talk about how you got into studying spiritual and religious issues?
Sure. Yeah. For me, it's something that comes very much out of my own personal story and background. So I was someone who was raised in a very, very conservative, theologically conservative, what you'd say a fundamentalist church, a very conservative Baptist church. and lots of really loving people trying to follow God and try to teach us a lot about the Bible and about what God is like, and um, what ultimate reality is like through a very kind of strict biblical lens. And the thing that I always struggled with the most, even from pretty early childhood, was we had the belief that I know that many conservative Christians have, that basically hell was not only real, but that this was the default place. This was where you were going to end up unless you did this very specific thing of knowing about Jesus, accepting Jesus as your savior, repenting of your sins, and depending who you talk to, maybe also needing to follow Jesus, with your behavior. But clearly, there was this born again salvation experience that you had to have. Otherwise, everyone was going to hell. And that was just a really, really terrifying view that I was exposed to when I was probably about 5 or 6 years old. So it's like, do you want to be saved? Of course. you know, how could you? Okay, I'd prefer not to go to hell. Yes, I'll accept Jesus. So that's something that was really hard for me growing up in a very devout, loving Christian family, parents trying to follow God, and, good people all around me in the church trying to follow God. But this is a pretty scary vision and view of God and of what's going to happen to most people after they die. And there's also this fear of, well, what if one person ends up in heaven and their whole family's in hell? How are they going to really enjoy heaven? Are they going to forget their family? There's all these questions you get into when you're taught something that's so scary. So I had a lot of other issues around a religion that came up as I went through my childhood and adolescence, like a lot of people do. You start having questions about whether certain things are literally true, or trying to make meaning of some tough types of scriptures, and certain things that were just really scary, like the hell things that I just didn't want to believe, but it was in the Bible. What was I supposed to do? So I ended up, after I had a different career that was in computer science. My undergrad was actually in computer science, and I worked in that field for a few years. But I realized I really wanted to go back to school and study psychology, because I wanted to do something that was analytical, but that also was more people oriented. My mom was a social worker, my dad's a teacher. We like to, do people stuff. And my computer job was focused on the production of tires. So I just could never really get excited about that. So when I went back to grad school, I ended up at Stony Brook University out on Long Island, and I just had a very, really excellent psychology training, very, very grateful for it. But nobody was talking about anything having to do with religion or spirituality there. I had to wait until I was right at the end of grad school when when I was on my clinical internship. I did my first psych of religion study with my grad school friend Ann Yali at my clinical internship site at Montefiore Medical Center. And we were really interested in the struggles and strains that people have around religion, even if they're still religious. What do people do if their view of God is more negative, if they worry about being punished by God, or if they're angry at God, or if they're having doubts about their faith, or if they're having conflicts with other people around religion. And we really saw this as a potentially like a valuable counterpoint to some of the research that was coming out at the time. This was in around the late 1990s that I'm talking about, that we started doing that work. In the 1990s, there was a little wave of research that was happening, that was all um, it was about how religion is good for you. It's good for your physical health. It's good for your mental health. And that was helpful in terms of giving the scientific study of religion and spirituality kind of a foothold. If you can tie it to things that psychologists care about, like physical and mental health, then it seems more reasonable to study it. But the focus on the positives, I felt like was at that time needing to be a little bit balanced out or nuanced with some of the more difficult, or like kind of the shadow side of religious belief. So that's what we were trying to contribute. And I was studying other basic social psychology things as well. This was like just like a side project that I did, and then some of that work uh, slowly took off. But I had to be careful because at a research university, at Case Western, uh, I was in again a traditional department, and my prospects for tenure weren't going to be very good if I was studying just a bunch of religious stuff. So it always had to be kind of a side thing until I got tenure, and then I did more of it. Most of the work's been when I was a full professor.
Well, thank you for sharing that. And that's it's just as you were talking, I don't know if people feel like this because you're a psychologist from background. It almost feels therapeutic to me to hear about your work, and I think that's why it's so interesting to me. Uh, so, how I got introduced to your work is from your spiritual and religious struggles scale, and specifically your work on spiritual and religious struggles in the workplace. But could you talk about your conceptualization on spiritual and religious struggles, and can you clearly define what that is?
Sure. So when we're talking about these religious and spiritual struggles, we're talking about um, situations, or I shouldn't say situations. We're talking about feelings of like conflict or strain, uh, that people are having around religious or spiritual beliefs or practices. So we're not necessarily implying that we're not trying to say like religion is bad. We're just saying that people often have inner conflicts or disagreements with other people about religion, or nagging doubts, kind of unpleasant feelings around some aspects of their beliefs about religious or existential things. And in terms of how these apply, in different settings, I know that you're particularly interested in the workplace. And one thing we haven't been able to do yet in our own work is to go into a workplace and give and like change the scale to focus specifically on things in the workplace. But we have done a little bit of writing. I did some work with my colleague David Bright. It's been a while now. It's probably been about 15 years ago. We published a little bit about a more conceptual paper about these struggles in the workplace. And if you think about it, in a workplace environment, you've got a lot of different people with a lot of different beliefs. And I know that there had been a trend that may still be continuing of trying to introduce more spirituality into the workplace, and having it be a more safe topic for people to have spiritual discussions or to engage in spiritual practices. And I think that, for a lot of people that can be really beneficial, but you're going to start having some interpersonal things around those. What are the acceptable beliefs and practices, and who's talking to whom, and who's going to the prayer meeting and who's not? And do we have to keep things so generic that maybe people who have a specific religious tradition they want to talk about feel like, oh, it's all getting so watered down that we can't even talk about God or something. I could see these different challenges that could come up. But the struggles that we're talking about things like ultimate meaning struggles, where people are questioning whether their life has a deep sense of purpose or value. Well, that's certainly something that could be relevant for so many people in their work, because so much of our meaning in life for many of us comes from wanting to have a sense of fulfillment and contribution and connection in our careers. And when we're not feeling that, that could certainly be part of what we would call these ultimate meaning struggles. And those out of the different types of spiritual struggles that we've studied, the ultimate meaning struggles are actually the ones that are the most closely tied to mental health. Things like depression and anxiety. So if somebody is really having trouble, like feeling perhaps that their work is meaningless, or that they spent all this time climbing the ladder of success and now they found out it was the wrong ladder, they've maybe been going in the wrong direction, or they spend all their time investing in a career and then suddenly lose their job or don't get the promotion that they were looking for. There are a lot of things in the workplace that could cause these kind of crises of meaning, or even raise for people. If you picture somebody in a tough workplace situation who believes in God, being passed over for a promotion, or losing a position, or having your company closed down, different types of layoff situations, or having a terrible boss. You could see a lot of people who believe in God, especially if they think God's supposed to help me and protect me, just feeling like, God, why aren't you doing anything about this situation? Why are you letting me suffer in this terrible work situation? So I'm not going to go through like every possible spiritual struggle and how it might play out in the workplace, but I mean, these spiritual struggles are really everyday human concerns. Most people at some point or another, even people who aren't religious, will endorse some level of these struggles. You know, interpersonal disagreements with people around religion, questioning their life's meaning, moral types of struggles. So these are all things that could certainly carry over into the workplace environment that I know you've been more focused on, Brandon.
And I think all of those things are really relevant because, in the back of our mind, we have our values and we have our morals and our beliefs that anchor us and ground us. And when those change, or when, an event happens, like we don't get the promotion or we get laid off or something happens, I can definitely see that being a big impact. And ultimately that could impact employee performance. That could impact, how much money the firm makes. So if you think down the line, it has real implications for business. But how prevalent is this? So when we talk about spiritual struggles, do you have statistics or even anecdotal evidence on how common is this? Not necessarily in the workplace, but just for people in general.
Yeah, we've done a couple of studies. One of them was larger, had like 17,000 people in it, but it wasn't quite as representative. And another more recent one that was more representative, but with just a few thousand people. It looks like if you're asking people just about the prevalence of struggles they've experienced recently, like just within the past month, to what extent have you experienced any of these struggles? The numbers that we get are often in the realm of about half of people. Like, depending how you count them, it could be as high as 60, 70%, depending on which questions you're asking, which types of struggles you're focusing on. So if you've got something like, do you feel like the devil's bothering you? That's going to be endorsed less. Maybe like 20% of people might say, yes, I have felt that way. But these are very, very common situations. So just looking at something like anger at God, for example, which a lot of people are reluctant to admit to, because it seems, scary to admit that you're angry at God, either socially or because you're afraid God will be mad. There was a general social survey item that was given on that specific question about 20 years ago. And it was something like 60+ percent of people said that they were sometimes angry at God. So, and there you're getting people who you're you're usually going to get underreporting of something like that because people are afraid. So it was basically suggesting that in the US, well over half of people were admitting that at some point in their life they had been angry at God. And in the studies that we look at, where we're looking at the past month or so, again, depending which questions you're focusing on, what you're asking, you could have anywhere from, you know, 35 to 70% of people, depending on, what kind of struggle you're asking about. A big take home message from our work on spiritual struggles has just been that they're extremely common. And it's important for people to know that, because a lot of these experiences can be so isolating. For people who are in religious communities, for example, especially if you're in what we might call more of a high control religious community, where you have to kind of follow authority and you're not supposed to ask questions. If you're having a lot of doubts about your faith, or if you're feeling like God's punishing you, or if you feel angry at God, um, that might be seen as, who's safe to talk to about this. People are often really reluctant uh, to bring these things up. So we really want people to know just how common these experiences are. And if somebody were to ever come to you and say, I'm feeling angry at God, or I'm having these doubts about my faith, just giving them the response of, I think a lot of people feel that way. That's totally understandable. Even if you don't know what else to say to them, you can't fix their anger at God. You can't take away their doubts. Just having them know that it was cool that they shared that, and thanks for sharing that. It takes a lot of courage. From what I've heard, over half of people have felt that way. you know, that could really normalize these things for people, whereas otherwise they might just feel really ashamed and not be able to admit, to not only on a survey, but might not be able to admit to people close to them or even to themselves that they're angry at God or that they're having doubts. I mean, some of the people who I have had conversations with who I think were the most angry at God were the ones who couldn't say it. You could tell that they were feeling frustrated and that they were trying to have faith after something terrible had happened in their lives, but they weren't allowed to go there and admit any kind of negative emotion toward God, or that that's caused them to question any of their beliefs. And you could just kind of see it in people's demeanor, how hard they're trying to just kind of be positive, be stoic, kind of hold it all in. And just, as with a lot of, forbidden psychological topics, just giving people a space to be honest about what they're feeling, where they don't feel judged and where they know that this is a common experience and that it's super understandable, that helps people so much.
Thank you for sharing that. I'm glad to hear that it is prevalent because I think a lot of topics, mental health especially, but that's become more normalized, are it's a common human experience. And with such a core belief as religion, religion's kind of taboo to talk about in the workplace, and it may be more difficult. So where can you go to talk about it? And you're probably going to talk about it with other religious adherents of your same community. But if that's looked down upon to doubt or to express anger at God, I can see that being very isolating, and I can even see that being difficult. You're going to have all that anger, and it may be easier to just turn away from belief. It may just be easier to have some outburst or something. So when I do my research, I try to tie it back to firm performance as defined as increased sales, increased productivity. That's just the nature of my research. But as you're doing this, do you have a goal in mind as to help alleviate suffering, to help people flourish, to help people do this? I know, some people may also think by normalizing this, we're going to help people maintain faith. What is the main role of identifying and studying this? What are you trying to do with this?
Yeah, it's a great question, Brandon. And I have to admit, a lot of my research has been what I would call just more basic research of trying to measure these things, trying to see how common they are, look at the things that predict them, look at the mental health consequences, etc. So I wouldn't say that I'm going into it with any kind of really firm agenda, even research agenda, other than I would say that a lot of it really is wanting to have the assessment tools for it and wanting people to know that the experiences are common. Because beyond that, I want people to be able to grow through their struggles personally, but that may or may not mean that their faith is going to increase. You know, um, some people are going to end up leaving a faith community and they're going to see that as being growth for them. Other people are going to become more deeply engaged in their faith, and that's going to be seen as growth. Or it might be that, some of your beliefs have to just be shifted a little bit and then something clicks. But it's, I think, a key message, and I'm really glad that you led us down this path. And a lot of this, I worked on my close colleague Ken Pargament and I wrote a book on working with spiritual struggles in psychotherapy, with Guilford Press a few years ago, and Ken's been a very close collaborator. And a lot of this work on the idea of people possibly growing through struggle is is work that he's written about, and that he and his students have done a lot of this too. With with struggles, we want to be clear that we're not saying that these are like spiritual symptoms or that it's just the bad side of religion. Struggle implies this opportunity to really engage around something, that you're having a rough time with. So we're trying to imply this sense of conflict or kind of wrestling with some of these issues that now granted, it may not lead to growth. Sometimes people will just like get depressed or disengage, or become apathetic. But often there is the potential to see things in a new way. You might have to challenge some of the beliefs that you were taught back at an age where that's all you could understand. You might need to assert yourself in maybe a religious environment where there's a lot of control going on. Sometimes you might decide that you need to, you're shifting your own beliefs and they may or may not fit on the grid of your particular faith community anymore. These could all be seen developmentally as real growth opportunities for a person. But that doesn't mean that it's fun while it's happening. So if you look at people while they're struggling, often it's not going to look like they're growing at all. And some of the studies that Ken and his students have done, and some of the work that we've done too, if you try to see whether people feel like they've grown while they're in the storm, you get a really mixed picture. But a lot of times when people look back afterward on any kind of life struggle, this isn't specific to spiritual struggles, you can see how, well, if that hadn't happened, I wouldn't have had these other changes in my life that brought me to a different place. So I want to be really clear that I want people to be able to grow from struggles, but I also don't want to sentimentalize the struggles because when people are really hurting, and really scared and having conflicts with people or feeling angry, I think it's important not to go in and minimize that and saying, "Oh, this is just a growth opportunity for you," and discount, they just had the loss of a child or somebody at church just told them that their loved one is in hell because they believe that, people are people have good reason to be upset about stuff. So we're trying to let them have that space to be honest about what their struggles are and what they're feeling so that they feel safe. Hopefully in some way or another they'll grow. But I wouldn't say that I'm interested in struggles primarily like just as growth opportunities. And I'm thinking about these business models where it's like too much of a growth orientation. Sometimes it's like just wanting to help people maintain and to feel safe, is what I'm looking for. To have them if they're sinking, kind of bring them to a point where they're not feeling alone and where they know that they're being comforted by another person, by their beliefs, maybe by God, depending how they see things. Want them to feel safe. And then hopefully they'll be able to find a greater sense of peace, and that will open the door to more hope and more growth in the future.
And I could see it being very problematic. Oh, you have this trial 6 months from now, you're gonna be all the better person. Think about how much
Exactly.
better it's gonna be. Minimize that struggle and that belief.
Yeah, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, right? You got to pick yourself up by your bootstraps. I mean, it's the last thing we need to do for people who are struggling or grieving or depressed. Anybody who's been in those situations, which is most of us, one of the worst things is for somebody to kind of come in and say, "Well, cheer up," or you got to put a smile on your face. If somebody says that to you, you often just feel really like aggressive in response, or just want to shut the person out or feel hurt. So safety for people struggling, I would say, is my top priority. And then you trust that the good stuff will happen after that.
I agree. And when we're talking about spiritual struggles, is this something that can apply to different world religions, or is this something from a more, North American Christian context?
That's a great question. This is something that has been documented in many countries around the world and in a variety of faiths. We've had some papers with Hisham Abu Raya looking at spiritual struggles among both Muslims and Jews in Israel. There have been studies looking at these struggles among Hindus. We've had several papers looking at them among atheists and agnostics. Some work with the spiritual but not religious, people who've left religion. And from what we can tell, we had that one big study of 17,000 people that I mentioned. We were definitely able to document that yes, these struggles do occur across like all the major world religions. and then among people who are spiritual and among people who are not religious. I mean, obviously, if somebody doesn't believe in the devil, they're not going to report demonic struggles. But a lot of the struggles around God, for example, some people who are atheists and agnostics, depending how the question is worded, they might still have some energy around those topics because of either they were raised to believe in God and it's a nasty God they don't want to believe in, or they might still have doubts about whether God exists. So the struggle experience is one that you don't want to assume is confined to a particular religious group or even to religious people. Uh, these are basic existential struggles about what it means to be human and what our core beliefs are. So, at some level, I think they're pretty universal.
Think these struggles are more than just a struggle themselves, because if you're struggling with your faith or your belief in God, or if you're angry at God, it's more than just yourself. It can oftentimes have social consequences relating to your work. Maybe if you work in a religious setting or with religious people, it can have consequences in your marriage or in your family. If you come from a devout, church background, and you're someone who has to pull away or something, it creates a lot more tension than purely just the struggle of trying to figure out if God exists, or questions relating to faith. So it's a lot more than just the problem itself that you're trying to explore.
Yeah, and the interpersonal dynamics you're talking about can get so complicated and contentious. Then these days, in the United States, with the way that religion and politics have become more and more intertwined. I mean, it's always been there, but it's some of that's really front and center now. With the level of political polarization that we have in the United States, and with some of that kind of falling, religion kind of getting mixed up into all of that as well, that really is gonna add fuel to the fire of these, like, family conflicts, around the holidays, or people that you used to be friends with that you're no longer friends with. It's partly religious reasons, but, oh, the political differences really sealed the deal. And, of course, people who are struggling with these interpersonal things or with other struggles, they struggles can lead to things like depression and anxiety over time. That's been well documented. My colleague Margaret Bachrath and some of us were on a big meta analysis about this. So, people who are having serious struggles might become anxious, might become depressed, and then that's going to further the problems with other people in the workplace, et cetera. Because, as you know, once you get depressed, there's that just motivational drop where people can become apathetic, irritable, and not take much of a sense of joy or meaning from anything that they're doing. So, if these spiritual struggles are one of many pathways that can lead people toward depression, that's why we want people to have the ability to recognize what the struggles are, to feel safe acknowledging them, to try to work through them as one way to improve their mental health, which, as you said, will help, have nice ripple effects in other areas of life too, including the workplace.
And I feel like it kind of cheapens it a little bit. This is such a big question. It's like, well, we want you to be okay spiritually so you can go make us more money. So sometimes I feel like dirty isn't the right word, but sometimes I feel, kind of cheap tying everything back to that. But that's just the nature of my position and what I'm doing.
Yeah. But those, regardless of whether it's focused on the company's bottom line or not, we know that for people in general, their relationships, their love and their work, are such a big part of life that regardless of whether it's affecting the company's bottom line or not, and we're getting into like money things, um, people's feeling that they're spending their time in a way that's meaningful and they're making meaningful contributions to the world and are using their skills and interests in putting that energy in a good way, that's going to be important for people, and that's going to play out in the workplace, even though um, those questions about what we're each contributing together and separately to kind of human good connections and love and all of that, that's what really matters. But a workplace where people are feeling engaged, cared about, motivated, is going to be a happier place for everyone. And maybe it'll be a place with a that's continuing to bring in money and stuff too. But yeah, there's no guarantee.
Mhm. Have you gotten any pushback on your work? Because a lot of people may have spiritual struggles around specific issues, specific theological issues. And I'm not asking you to talk about theological issues, but if someone's feeling conflicted about a specific idea of hell, or if a certain type of relationship, maybe homosexuality is okay, if people are feeling conflict over that and are having spiritual struggles of that may be a theological belief. So have you ever gotten pushback from people because you are damaging faith, or because you're stuff like that? You're taking away faith. You're one of these people who's causing faith crisis. You're deconstructing. What has that looked like?
Yeah, yeah, great question. Like, am I undermining people's faith by encouraging them to look at their doubts? Um, I think it's a fair question because when people start delving into these struggles that they're having, for some of them, their faith is going to be shifted in some way. For other people, for some people, they might feel that their faith is just strengthened, and others, it might end up really eroding or going in a different direction. I would say an area where I really ran into the types of pushback that you're talking about is back when I was studying anger toward God, which was actually the big topic that got me into this in the first place. So I was giving a lot of talks on this about uh, 15, 20 years ago. And I remember giving the exact same talk to a variety of audiences that basically talked about how, anger at God was really common. It was associated with distress, but a lot of people felt this way. And it was a very simple set of preliminary findings. But after that talk, I had people come up to me again, same talk. One person saying, I don't know why you're pathologizing this anger at God so much. Like this, we should be angry. What's your problem? They thought that I was pathologizing it. And then I had more people come up to me saying, like, I really don't think we should be talking about this. Kind of like the lightning bolt's going to come down. And they saw it as disrespectful to God or to the faith to even raise these kinds of questions. So, and again, that was from like the same talk. So, depending on, I think, what people are dealing with themselves, the mindset they're coming from, maybe the struggles that they're having, um, the work that been doing could be kind of a projective test where some people could think that I'm being too anti-religion. Other people might think that I'm being too pro-religion. So yes, there's the pushback. And now with the kinds of things that I'm studying in my new position, I expect to get different types of pushback from religious people because the things that we're studying are a little bit more off a lot of the traditional uh, Christian and monotheistic grids.
So let's talk about your position right now. And I know you've only been there a few months, so I'm sure you're familiar with the work, but you've been settling into your new position. Could you tell us about some of the things you're studying? You mentioned you're going to have some new struggles, some new opportunities. So could you talk about that a little bit more?
Sure. Uh, so I'm not going to go super in depth about the types of research that we're doing here because most of it is work that my colleagues are doing. So I'm happy to give the shout out to them, but I also want to be very careful not to misrepresent anything that they're doing. Um, but let me just first give you a little bit of the bigger picture. Part of what I'm hoping to do in this position. So I'm the research director at this place, DOPS, Division of Perceptual Studies. And we study all these extraordinary phenomena around this life death boundary, including the near death experiences, the little kids who have these memories that might suggest reincarnation, people who have are dying and see visions of deceased loved ones, people who feel like they're getting messages from deceased loved ones, all these kind of things. My own, uh, I had a few experiences in my own life around my parents' deaths, passings, that were interesting. They weren't the kind of things that would persuade a skeptic, but it seemed like some kind of a message from them. and I certainly hadn't been raised to believe such things were possible. I mean, in my church tradition growing up, that would have been seen as like that was the devil. People are either in heaven or hell, and they're not talking to you here. If you think so, you're into the occult, and this is the devil, and this is bad, bad, bad. So when I had some of these experiences myself and started looking into it more, I saw that there was this whole huge literature. And I'd had some exposure to some of the ideas about near-death experiences earlier in my career, but just a little bit. And once I started looking and seeing all of the different forms of study that have been going on for many, many years, and the evidence around these phenomena, for me, it provided some uh, really interesting uh, evidence to consider that would suggest that, okay, so we might have something here beyond just the theology suggesting that there's um, life that continues in some form beyond the life death boundary, and that's really encouraging for a lot of people. But then the form that it takes often doesn't quite fit the grid, like of what I was taught or of any particular religious tradition. So it's kind of like when people sometimes they'll have these spontaneous out of body experiences, which my colleague Marina Weiler studies, or people will have a psychedelic experience, which we've done a little bit of research on that. My colleague Kim Pemberthy is doing the first psychedelic study here at UVA with people who with prolonged grief. Sometimes people will have these experiences and uh, they seem to point to some kind of exciting other dimension of reality. But what do you do if that doesn't fit the religious text or teachings that you had? So a lot of times people having had these experiences or learned these things uh, come back and they're kind of not sure where they fit. They're like, do I still belong in my faith tradition? Can this fit in there? Am I going to get in trouble for believing this? And am I crazy? So people often have a lot of trouble kind of integrating not only these experiences if they've had them, but just the knowledge about these experiences. So I know that back when I was young, I mean, this is like, you know, early adolescence, when some of the books were coming out about near death experiences, I was taught that this was like from the devil and it was bad. And I just kind of blocked it off. Like I didn't want to know about it. I kind of couldn't handle it. So so I know what that feels like. So I'm thinking that in my own work, part of what I'm hoping to do is to go back more to Christians and others in religious communities to find out more about their own beliefs about things like near death experiences or human spirits or getting messages from deceased loved ones. Do they think that that's real? Do they think that it's from the devil? Have they ever had an experience like that? So I'd like to bring some of the information from DOPS, the place I work now, back to some of these groups just to give people food for thought and see what they think about it. And I'm expecting to get some pushback there because I know what it was like for me when I was in that situation. And I still have certain beliefs that kind of scare me and that I don't want to think about. So when people start talking about um, certain types of psychic phenomena or some of the things having to do with um, life on other planets or things like this, I'm kind of like, I just can't go there. Like it might be real. I don't want to deal with it. So I know what that feels like. But if you're in a higher control religion where you're really not allowed to question, and it really has to be very by the book and by our group's interpretation of the book, then it could be super threatening to have this kind of information come in, especially because in a lot of these situations that like these near death experiences that people have, they're talking about God, the divine presence, or sometimes I was sitting with Jesus, or sometimes it was just this general thing, but it was all loving and there are a few experiences that might suggest um, some kind of more punishing or scary afterlife, but it seems like it might be more temporary that people can get out of it. So it's not lining up real well with this either. You go to heaven or you go to hell, that I was raised with. And I find these possibilities that I've been learning about lately to be much more hopeful, and it's been much more, um, it's put me in a much better place emotionally to think, okay, so maybe ultimate reality and life looks more like this. Maybe the divine God, love looks more like this, and not like the scarier beliefs that I was raised with. So for me, that's been good, but it's very mysterious. We just want people to be able to embrace the mystery of it. We don't have all the answers. I mean, these are fascinating phenomena that if anyone claims to have a total handle on it, I think that's uh, they're being probably speaking a little too far beyond the evidence if they claim to have it figured out. But
Mhm.
some people are going to be shaken up and not want to think about these things, and I don't blame them. It's scary to have your view of the world challenged.
Definitely. And as you're doing this, is it just exploring all, I don't know if supernatural is the right word, but just all phenomena, or is it trying to prove something like there is a dimension, there is a heaven, there is a,
We're
spiritual realm?
we're having to be so we have to be really careful in our work in this area um, about terminology and about what we're trying to do. So in my prior work, I had done work with my colleagues Josh Wilt and Nick Stauner and Ken Pargament on what we called supernatural attributions. We had a grant from the Templeton Foundation to study this, like we did for our spiritual struggles work. And so we were studying things like, do you think that God is giving you a message, or that the devil's interfering in your life, or that something is fate or destiny, or that there's spirits? So we had this kind of broad supernatural label that we used. Um, Here at the Division of Perceptual Studies, they don't tend to use the term supernatural. They tend to focus on things being non-physical or non-material, things that aren't bound to can't be explained by at least what we know currently about like reductionistic, um, mechanistic material models of things. But they don't tend to go there and use the word supernatural because I think that can imply for people something more religious or something more magical, maybe. And here, I think the goal is to just study these phenomena that are mysterious, try to understand them better, uh, and consider evidence about whether or not like people have some kind of transcendent consciousness that can go out of their bodies, or that if there's a consciousness that survives physical death. But we're certainly not trying to just cherry pick the cases that would make it, clear that's so. We're trying to look at people's subjective experiences that they're having around these things. We're trying to understand who believes these things and why, what the consequences are. So we're really just trying to understand these things more. And we're also wanting other people to know that there are these interesting experiences that people have been having for, millennia, that we've been studying scientifically for a while. We just want people to know that the research is there and that it's something that they could come and check out and form their own opinions about. We just want people to be curious. We're not trying to persuade them of any particular worldview or to say we know this is all about, whatever it is. It's all quantum, or it's all God, or it's all some particular religious view that we're trying to make everybody embrace. But if whatever people learn about these things, um, a lot of these experiences do help people to feel more connected to some kind of loving ultimate reality, whether it's feeling more interconnected with nature, more connected with God, and anything that's going to make people feel more of that loving connection um, within themselves, between themselves and others, that tends to lead to good things in terms of mental health, treating other people better, uh, and of course, being happier at work, Brandon.
Yeah, yeah, bring it all back to work and money, and thanks for sharing that. That's really interesting. So, in your work, and it may vary, but do you take a stance on viewing these things, not you personally, but in general, of them being, byproducts of someone's psyche, or is it more, the division takes a stance like there is something out there and we're trying to explore it? Or is it just they are subjective and this is just a trait that humans have as they attribute meaning to something outside of themselves and they believe? that there is a term that I can't remember you used, but not supernatural. There is a something
Non-physical, non-material.
non-physical, non-material something.
Yeah, that's also a great question, and this is, again, where I wanna be really careful to say, we're not we're not coming at this with an agenda of, "We're trying to prove that this is all in the brain," or, "We're trying to prove that it's not all in the brain." But we want the explorations that we're doing here at DOPS need to include the possibility that the brain and the body are involved in all these things, of course, but that maybe there is a part of it that doesn't require the brain or the physical body. So there's a part that could extend beyond. So we're trying to be open to that, and we're considering evidence in some cases that might suggest that. But yeah, we're not going to come out and say we're trying to prove the afterlife is a thing, or we've proven it. Yeah, I'm certainly not saying that. But a lot of people don't even know that research exists on these topics, and we would like them to at least check it out.
Yeah,
There's a lot.
I think it's fascinating. So I think you're going to do a lot of great work there as you continue in your role, but kind of turning back to the work that you've done in your career so far, have you seen the needle move either on a personal level, but also in the general, you know, milieu around spiritual and religious struggles? How have you seen it change, and what's been the impact of your work?
That's a tricky question to answer because in terms of the scale that we developed, the religious and spiritual struggle scale, we just published that back in 2014. We've published some shorter versions of it since then. I feel like we're just getting going on this. I think that more of what we've been doing has been trying to open up, at least within the field of psychology and the fields that psychology touches, having this be a viable topic of conversation, a viable topic of study, where people don't just keep these things to themselves, but they know that they're common and that they can be studied, in a scientific way. I think that we've seen because we and many other researchers have focused on these types of topics, the knowledge about it is increasing. So it's becoming more of a safe topic of conversation. That's what I would say. And actually, that's similar to what I'm hoping for in our work at DOPS. We just want we want these topics around the boundary of life and death, for example, to become more normal topics that people can talk about and aren't afraid to talk about. I think that we have started to move the needle on that, at least within the field of psychology on spiritual struggles, because we have the measure and we have papers coming out and there's a term for it now that people can use. But, we haven't been doing this research for that long and we don't have all of these amazing interventions for spiritual struggles that we're pouring out into the communities. So it's not as though I would say, oh, it's suddenly going to, spiritual struggle levels are going to rapidly decrease. It's more that, okay, now we can at least assess when somebody's having a struggle and what kind of struggle they're having a little more systematically than we could before. All right, that's something.
Well, I think it's great. And I think questions around God and religion and the non material have existed forever and they will exist forever. But I think thinking back to a couple hundred years ago, maybe during the Industrial Revolution and beyond, it seems like we got less and less comfortable talking about these things. And it's, we're putting more and more trust in science. And I don't want to say discounting that, but almost like compartmentalizing the two, almost separation of church and state, separation of science and religion. And, it seems like there's a shift in the broader society last, I don't know, 10, 15 years that this is more okay to talk about, that this is an actual, thing people deal with. And you're not, a naive person for involving religion or the non material in your life. And I feel like it's something that, especially since COVID, I feel like we're starting to see this more and more, almost like the pendulum swung towards, all belief is non-scientific to the point where let's explore this and talk about these issues. And maybe that's just in the popular media. We're seeing more of that, but that's something I feel like I've been able to see even within the last couple of years.
Yeah, I think having the focus on spirituality and religion as opposed to just talking about religion has helped a lot because there are a lot of people who either weren't raised with religion or who've been turned off by religion that still, are more comfortable with the idea of spirituality and spiritual connection, things like mindfulness meditation, um, finding a deep sense of meaning in life, asking existential questions. Those types of topics people are often pretty comfortable talking about if you can let them know that we're not necessarily wrapping this around, or we're not wrapping a religious agenda around this. I think too there's been increased focus, at least within psychology, on understanding the many ways that people are different from each other, culturally, um, in terms of age, ability, religion being another important difference between people, that there's a lot more material available on, like, for therapists on how to work with people from different religious backgrounds, and that helps to make it more acceptable in something like a therapy context. And I think a popular thing that we've seen too is that there's been such an increased interest in psychedelics, and in meditation. I know psychedelics aren't legal still in a lot of places, but there's been a lot of attention to them lately. And a lot of times, people who aren't religious might have some kind of powerful transformative experience using a substance like that, or in meditation, perhaps, that ends up making them more okay talking about spiritual types of topics too. It's like they've had some kind of a spiritual experience with the assistance of that substance. And I think that's been a big game changer kind of topic that's come up, along with more attention scientifically and philosophically and otherwise to the study of consciousness, which is a lot of what we study here at DOPS. You've got physicists and biologists and philosophers and psychologists and neuroscientists all talking about consciousness. So when you're talking about consciousness, you could start getting into some of these other areas as well of these topics that we probably weren't talking about as much collectively 20 years ago.
Mhm. So if someone looks at your work or watches this interview and, they look at your scale, they look at the different dimensions, and they kinda can put a name to a face of what they are, um, experiencing, and, maybe someone's going through a spiritual struggle, do you have any advice for someone who's going through a spiritual or religious or existential struggle? Maybe it's part of their everyday life that they feel like they have to go through, just the ups and downs of a religious life, or maybe there's some big existential crisis they're going through.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the ways that people can find comfort are going to depend on the type of struggle that they're having. So if somebody feels like they're being tempted by the devil, that's pretty different from disagreeing with people about religious doctrines, or being angry at God, or having moral questions around your sexuality. So in terms of the specifics of what people do, it's going to depend on the specific struggle. But so much of it is um, just knowing, first of all, that you're not alone, that many, many people experience these struggles, so you're in good company. But also finding just a safe person to process with, which might be, it might be someone in the clergy, it might not, might be a friend or family member. And there's also increasing communities of people available who talk to people about these types of issues. Um, you might not be familiar, those of you watching, but there's a whole group of people called spiritual directors who aren't really directing your spirituality so much. It's just kind of an old term. But they're people that you can talk with about these spiritual and existential questions. So it's kind of like therapy, but not quite, because it's not focused on your symptoms. And you might have spiritual readings or practices that you would talk about, or that would be assigned. But spiritual directors can be a great resource. Uh, and there's a group called Spiritual Directors International that actually has like a directory that you could find a spiritual director to talk to. So for a lot of people, that can be a really great resource. And then just giving yourself time to work through it and trust that it's okay that you're having this struggle. You'll get through it, and hopefully this will set the stage for some type of insight, some type of change in your life where you'll be able to look back later and say, "Oh, that actually did help me grow.
Thank you for that. And I think we're also seeing, a lot of this. I know if you go online, it's popular to see things from ex evangelicals or ex Mormons or ex atheists, people who come back to faith. So I think it is more and more common. And I think it's great that we are talking about it from many different standpoints, from a personal standpoint, from a religious standpoint, from a business standpoint. So interests me a lot, the work you're doing, and I'm excited to see the further work that you do at Dobbs.
Thank you so much, Brandon. I just have one other thing I wanted to say that I had forgotten. I'm just getting into some research. Some of it's with my grad student, Johannes Keller, on what we call forgiving religious communities. So with some of the groups that you talked about, the evangelicals and others who've left, we've done a fair amount of research in my research group on people leaving religion. And I think that those resources can be really useful for people to be like, oh, there's other people who have left or other people who are thinking about leaving. I think one challenge that sometimes comes up, at least in the podcast spheres and things around those communities, is that a lot of times it's people who, are just leaving or who are still really, really feeling a lot of energy, maybe anger type of energy, focus back on the community. And that's totally understandable. We're trying to get into some research now on whether, of course, people have a right to be angry and upset, but longer term, the idea of forgiving members of your religious community or even forgiving like religion as a whole might be something that would help people to kind of heal so that your only memories of the religious community aren't just based on, you know, anger and regret. Like, I wish I'd never been a part of that. Because if you think about the idea that we often like to use this metaphor of the nautilus shell, that like every experience in your life is part of who you are today. And as much as some people might just want to kind of cut off their religious background, like that it never existed, God doesn't exist. I wish I'd never been in this group. It's terrible. Of course, if people have had, like religious trauma or these really spiritually harmful experiences, of course they could feel like that. And it makes complete sense. But longer term, they're being able to kind of integrate your religious trauma or your struggles into your life story in some way, um, coming to some greater sense of peace about it might might be part of a process of just feeling like a whole person. Like I don't have to cut off this part of my past. This is part of who I am today. I'm not going back to where I was. It's another thing about that nautilus shell is you can't go back into the prior chambers. You have to kind of keep growing. But learning to integrate that and even embrace that as okay, this is part of my story. These people were part of my past. There was some good there. um, might just help people to feel like, yes, I did leave, I did move on, but I'm not being now weighed down and held back by this anger. It's like I have to stay angry in order to stay connected to my decision to leave. You could decide to leave and at some point say, that anger really helped me to leave and it helped me to get clear about what I want. And I'm glad for that I felt angry. But now all of a sudden, this anger is like, now it's just kind of a weight on my back. You might be able to keep all the progress you've made and maybe gradually at your own pace, you get to choose when and how and if letting some of that anger go. Your life might be a little bit more peaceful without losing any of the important choices that you've made or any of the wisdom that you've gained along the way.
And I feel like going back to our conversation about the interpersonal relationships, that would probably help. If you have to go home for Christmas and a lot of your family's still in this community, it may help smooth a lot of those things over with, the interpersonal aspects outside of yourself. But I know we're running low on time and I feel like we've had a good conversation today. I could just talk forever, but I know you have stuff to do. Um, but does any of your work or are you familiar with like stages of faith, like Fowler stages of faith? I know that's something I don't know if it's from like a pure psychology lens, but I know it's something that's been explored before. Could you touch a little bit on that and how you view it? And 'cause I didn't even think about that when preparing for this interview, but could you talk
Sure,
about that a little bit?
sure. And I'll be embarrassed here because even though I taught about the stages of faith and some other developmental models in my psych of religion and spirituality class at Case Western, I can't remember all the names of all the different levels, the different stages and things. The main point being that when people are young, um, as we are learning things, a lot of times it's very focused when we're little kids on like rewards and punishments. So, you know, taking things from our parents, like, is God kind of like this authority figure that seems like your parents, and you don't want to make God angry, you might get in trouble. And you get older and you're thinking more about um, you're able to have more abstract concepts, but a lot of times you get very focused on the group. God, religion is the one that has God, and in-group loyalty becomes like your primary source of like primary moral foundation, as Jonathan Haidt might say. So it's all about my religious group is the one with all the answers, and I have to be loyal to my group no matter what, and I can't question them, and I can't question the leadership, and all the other groups are wrong, and we have to win. And then as people get older, a lot of people don't ever get past that stage of just kind of in-group loyalty, and that's where their religious life stays. They'll be like, the Baptists are the best. No, the Catholics. No, the Jews are the best. A lot of people never get past that, as we can see from all the religious wars, right? But as people, if they do continue to develop, morally, cognitively, spiritually, there's different frameworks for all of these things. It's as people move to a point where they're able to start questioning, maybe I don't need to rigidly apply these rules that I was taught in every situation. There might be situations where I might need to, the more loving thing to do or the more moral thing to do might be to bend that kind of overly simple rule that I was taught when I was younger. I can see why the rule was there, but it seems like it maybe needs to be more nuanced. And then as people continue to develop, at least according to Fowler's model and others, a lot of times you're moving toward greater humility, greater openness to changing your ideas, more acceptance of other people, not judging them so harshly, where your beliefs basically become more and more um, like oriented toward kind of universal love and benevolence. That's kind of seen as the top developmentally in most of these types of theories. A lot of people get scared of challenging their early beliefs. So a lot of the early struggles are from our childhood beliefs of, if I question what I was taught about God, God's going to be mad at me. God's going to zap me. That's kind of like stuff from early childhood that might be in our heads. Or, God's on the side of my group. We got to win. That's like kind of like early adolescent kind of thinking, but a lot of us are still stuck in it, right? We certainly don't see any of that in our country. So, it's like my side has to win. God's on our side. And then as people start to go beyond that, it starts to be a belief system that's more flexible, more inclusive, but it can also be more scary because those early things about this is what you literally believe, or this is what our group believes, they help people to feel safe by having that structure. I'm going to stay on God's good side if I do these things or don't do these things, or if I'm part of the right group. And then when you start becoming more flexible, or in some cases, I would say having the courage to question, challenge those things, a person, even a very devout person, you can do this challenging of beliefs without challenging God's authority. You're just raising questions. We actually made that distinction in one of our studies between asking God tough questions and challenge versus questioning God's authority. It is a different thing. Um, but people often conflate it. Like, I don't want to question God. And you can just picture how a lot of that is like this. For many of us, it's like that scared little child inside. Like, I don't want to get in trouble. Like, God's mean and he's gonna smack me or worse, if I do something wrong. So I would just say, to the extent that people can remain open to becoming the most caring, loving, connected people that they can be, and to the extent if they, still believe in God, or some type of, spiritual source like that, to the extent that leads you in a direction of more love, more hope, um, more integrity, more peace in your life, that's probably going to be a good sign and a good direction, I would say, as a psychologist. You know, everybody has their own worldview of what ultimate reality is, and there's all these different theological views. So I'm just telling you, as a psychologist, not as a theologian, anything that brings you more of a sense of, meaning, purpose, energy, especially if it's going in a loving direction, it isn't just all about yourself and protecting yourself. it's probably you're moving in a good way. Um, and if that means that you're challenging some of your prior beliefs, that doesn't mean that your earlier beliefs were wrong or that you were dumb for having them. It's that as we grow and mature, this is part of the growing that often happens. And if you feel afraid of it, go ahead and feel afraid. It is kind of scary being alive sometimes. Uh, but I hope that you'll at least be open when you feel like you're being pulled toward some kind of new insight or new area in your life where you're it could help you to feel more alive, more at peace, more loving. It's probably a good thing, but you can still take it or leave it, and you could take as long as you want to get there.
Thanks for sharing that. And I think it has a couple different names. These stages of faith, I think there are a couple different conceptualizations, first half of life, second half of life. So I think it's something a lot of people experience. As we close today, is there anything you want to share that you haven't? And is there anything you want to leave us with?
Uh, I did want to mention the work by a few of my colleagues at DOPS that I didn't get to mention by name. So, in terms of work on near death experiences, um, my colleague Bruce Grayson has done more research than anyone else in the world on this topic, and wrote a wonderful book called After, looking at talking about his experience as a scientist who was not initially interested in near death experiences. Was a psychiatry resident, and then kind of had some things happen that started him on this journey of studying these experiences. So I highly recommend his book After. And my colleague Marietta Pelavinova is working a lot with Bruce on near death experiences now. Um, and Philip Cozzolino and Marietta Pelavinova are working on these children's memories of past lives. And Jim Tucker, who was the research director before me, has a wonderful book called Before. You can probably see some of these on my bookshelf behind me. Um, he did a lot of research following in the footsteps of Ian Stevenson, the founder of DOCS, looking at these children's memories suggesting past lives. And that book Before is a fantastic, these are the before and after are very easy, readable resources on these topics. And if you're interested in spiritual struggles, my book with Ken Pargament on working with spiritual struggles and psychotherapy was written more for therapists, but you might find some of those ideas helpful too. So how's that for a bunch of book plugs, Brandon?
That's great. That is awesome. If people are interested in your work, if they want to see more of what you do, how do they find you? How do they get in contact with you?
Uh, right now, I am somebody who personally doesn't use social media, but if you want to know about what we're doing at DOFS, we're quite active on social media, and we have a newsletter. Um, and we're also 100% donor supported. So if you ever want to support us uh, financially, we'd be thrilled about that. But if you just look at our website, the Division of Perceptual Studies at the University of Virginia, you can get links there to our newsletter, or you could look us up on social media. We have wonderful volunteers who are working for us to keep all of our social media outreach really active. And then the newsletter goes out regularly. We would love to keep you posted about what we're doing. But yeah, I have not really gotten into the private social media posting thing.
Julie, thank you so much for telling us about all your work and giving us a sneak preview and what the Division of Perceptual Studies has done and will be doing.
Great. Thank you so much, Brandon. I appreciate it.
And thank you everyone for listening. Make sure you go check out the Division of Perceptual Studies at the University of Virginia. Make sure you subscribe to the newsletter. Go by before, go by after, go donate and support and, fund all the work that they can because I think they're doing great work. But you have a great day. Happy learning, and I'll see you next time.
Thanks so much, Brandon.